Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be looking at one of Metoya's more complex components, and that is the card component. We're going to take a quick look at the documentation, analyze how we can build a card that looks specifically like this, that has icons at the bottom that are clickable, avatars, and images. And we're going to look at how to use a card in a grid layout so you can lay out cards on your site in a very nice and easy and clean manner. And finally, we're going to look at how to add an on hover effect to your card, so when you hover over it, it either highlights it or elevates the card upwards. And as always, if you find value in this video, please consider either hitting the like button, leaving a comment below on what topic you'd like to learn about next, or subscribing. It really helps the channel and it really helps get these videos out there. As usual, I'm going to be using CodeSandbox.io for all of our demos, and the link to the CodeSandbox.io will be in the description so you guys can fork it and play around with it, as well as I have a coding Discord community. The link to that will be in the bio, the description of this video as well. Please feel free to join if you want to. So let's jump straight into it. The card component has a lot of different components a part of it, and what I mean by that is if we scroll down to the very bottom, you'll see that there is a card component, but there is also a card action area component, card actions component, card content, header, and media component. It's one of the components that are a lot more complex in the sense that you have to really build it out. If we were to look at, for example, this simple card over here and look at the source code, we can see that in fact this specific card is built out of three components. Number one is the card itself, which is just the overall outline. And essentially, if you were to think of the card, it's all it is just really paper. A card is just a big thing of Material UI paper that sort of has elevation properties and border properties. The next thing we have here is card actions, which you'll see here is pretty much just this bar down here. And then we have card content, which is everything you see up here. And if we look at how they are actually using this, we can see here we have a card, which is everything is nested inside of it. Then we have our card content, and our card content, you can see, contains the title, for example, word of the day, which we can see up there. Then it has some more typography that fills out the rest of the card content, as you can see here. And at the bottom, within our card actions, all we have is a button. Now, this is probably one of the simplest cards you'll have. In fact, if you want an even simpler card, it would probably just be a card with card content, if you just wanted a card with simple writing inside of it. So let's go ahead and look at one that might be a bit more complex. For example, this card right here. This pretty much has every single thing you could fit into a single card, all in one. So for example, we have a header, and this header has some text, it has an avatar, and it has a icon that you can click on. We have an image here, which falls under the card media section. We have card content, and then finally we have card actions. But it doesn't just stop there. In fact, this card actions is collapsible. You can see here, if I click this, it'll drop down and have a bunch of different text in here. And if we were, let's look at the source code and see what's actually going on behind the scenes. So you can see here, we are pretty much importing every single thing that we need. And all of it is pretty much right here. And you can see all the stuff down here. All these imports are more so for just the specific icons that we are using. But if we were to scroll down, let's analyze how this code is working. So the first thing we have is our card, and inside of our card is where everything else is going to be nested. Then we have the card header. So the card header is a component in itself that is self-closing that you can place within the card, and everything that you want here you can pass in. Note that it's different from card media, for example, if you are card content, because if you look here, we have some text on the top and text on the bottom, but you don't pass that in as children the same way you did in the previous example, where you would pass in typography as children. In fact, these are just specific fields for title and subtitle, and these are the only fields that the only text fields you can have for the card header. As you'll see, we're going to look into the props quite soon. Now, the avatar gets passed in as a prop as well, and you can make this prop an element. So here you can see for the avatar prop, we are passing in Material UI's avatar component, and we are passing in pretty much the avatar component being used as just a way to display a single letter. This avatar component can also just be an image. It can be anything you want, really. Then we have this button over here, this icon button at the top, which you would put as action. So if you want an icon that does a specific thing, you can just pass in JSX that will act as whatever you want. So in this case, we have an icon button, which is pretty much just a wrapper that goes around an icon that will make it so that when you get close to the icon and you hover it, and when you click around it, it shows that sort of animation. And then you have the core icon in the middle, which is those three dots. And that is what's being passed down there. So now that we've looked at just specifically the header, let's look at the props that you can pass in just to sort of clarify. So you can see we have the action, we have the avatar, which we talked about, and then the other important things are the title and then the subheader. Which you can control. And then, like a lot of other Metoya UI components, you can control things like classes, components, the subheader typography props, and the title typography props. Those are for more complex use cases if you wanted to edit the props specifically for the subtitle and the header. So say, for example, if you wanted the subheader to be, for example, an H3 variant instead of what it probably comes at, which is like a paragraph typography, you could pass in this and set variant equal to H3. So you can control a lot of things like that, which is really nice. Metoya UI gives you a lot of control. Now let's look at the next thing we have that makes up our card. So we've talked about this header right now. Now let's look at this card media right here. Well, card media is extremely simple. Essentially what you do is you just create it with self-closing tags. You can give it a class name just like anything else. You give it a link to the image or the content that you want in between there. So for example, in this case, we're setting our image equal to whatever this image is that they have stored in their project. And finally, you can give it a title. And this title, I believe, is what's going to show up if you hover over it. As you can see, I'm hovering over the media, and we have the title Palea Dish, or whatever it's called. Another thing that's worth knowing about media is that usually you want to give it at least, sometimes it might not work out of the box without giving it some height. As you can see here, they give it a height of 0, which means it'll automatically take to the width of the image. But that is why they're passing that in there. And now let's go ahead and look at the actual API of the card media. And I'll open up all of these guys as well, just to save us some time in the future. Okay, so we're looking at the card media API. As you can see here, it's very basic. It takes in an image. So for example, like the source of the image, or you could specify source. So if you specify source, you're going to have to give it a minimum height for it to display, whereas you specify image, it's not. And you have to have at least one of these two components displayed. So for example, if you wanted to pass in like just audio or video, you could say source equals and then to the video link, and it will work fine. If they have a specific prop for image, where if you want to make it a specific image, it will automatically give that card media the height and width that is natural to your image, which is why they pass in specifically an image prop in the first place. And that's pretty much it. It has the basic, as usual, the basic classes and component and children stuff that you can pass in. So now let's look at the next part of this example. So now card content. This is pretty much the same as you saw before, with a slight complexity going on here. Well, actually, sorry, the slight complexity is for the card actions. For the card content, it's very basic. It's just typography passed in as children with whatever you want to display in the middle of the card. And you can see if we go to the card content API, it's extremely basic. It just contains the basic Metoya UI props that you can pass in, like children, classes, and component. So now let's go to card actions, where the actual complexity can come in. So you can see here that we have card actions, and below it we have collapse. And you're going to see what's happening here is for card actions, we are essentially passing in pretty much some icons that we want to display. And on the final icon, we can see here that we are giving it an on-click to handle the expand. And you'll see here that is being applied to this icon right here. When we expand it, what is going to happen is this collapse will be displayed. And if you're not familiar with collapse, it works like this not only for cards but for other like basic elements in Metoya UI. This is a separate Metoya UI component that you can just add into the card, but essentially what it does is it takes in a variable called in, And in this case, our variable is just a state variable called expanded, which is defined up here. And when this is when this in variable is false, aka when expanded is false, it is not going to show anything. But when it is true, it is going to show all of its children, and in this case its children is card content with all this typography. Now the cool thing about this is I can make this children sort of anything I want. I can make it card media or anything as well, and that will be able to show up when I click the drop down. So if you're looking for really complex cards, I really recommend going to the Metoya UI documentation and sort of playing around with this code. Another example on the documentation actually that I want to highlight is just this one down here with the lizard image. Pretty cool lizard. The one thing that is different about this one that the other one didn't have is all of their card media and their card content is wrapped around this card action area component, and essentially all that will do is when you hover over it, it will sort of create this like hover effect and this clickable effect. So if you're looking for a card that when you hover over it, it looks like that, essentially all you want to do is wrap it around in a card action area, whichever part you want around in card action area, and it'll give it that. And you'll notice it's very similar to the effect that icon button gives different icons. It's just sort of when you hover over it, it gives it this like nullified gray looking thing, and when you click it, it has this sort of cool ripple effect. So that's pretty much how you would make a card have a hover effect. The other way to do it is if you want it to sort of like elevate off the page, it's just adding custom CSS to the card using selectors, and whenever it is hovered, all it'll do is, like, for example, maybe change the box shadow or add a certain border animation or anything like that. Also, it's worth noting, if we go back to the card API, that you can actually add a raised property here as well. All this will really do is sort of just give your card a bit more box shadow as well. And the final thing I want to outline is over here. The final thing I want to outline is over here. You can give your card sort of a nice little outline look. And essentially the way you do that is in card. It's sort of weird. As we just saw from the card API, if I go back to it, they don't actually have variant listed here as a prop, but you can pass in so a variant equals outlined here. That's one thing that they don't really tell you in the documentation, that you just sort of pick up by using the component a lot. There's no actual variant prop in the documentation, and I guess that's just sort of a shortcoming of they might have forgotten to add that in, but you can do this. So let's talk about how to use things in Grid now that we've seen how everything else works. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially just straight up copy this entire card element. I'm going to come over here into Code Sandbox. I'm going to create a new thing called card.js. And I'm going to just pop this code in there. I think we have everything we need. All it requires is Metoya UI core, which I've already gone ahead and imported. And now in my app, I'm going to get rid of all this boilerplate code. I'm going to import card from the file. And we're going to have card here. And let's see if that works. And there we go. Here's our card. You'll see that our card is naturally going to just fit the available width of our container. So let's go ahead and try styling this. I'm going to open Paint up and sort of give you an idea. So I'm really bad with Paint, by the way, but I'm going to give you an idea of the layout I want. I pretty much want 3 cards in a row per row, and I just want them to be centered like this. I want there to be like even spacing between them over here. And I want there to be a little space, but a little padding from the right and left side of the thing. And I just want to display my cards in that sort of layout. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead here and we're going to import Metoya UI's grid. /grid. Now what we're going to do, wrong file. So we're going to keep the card component the same, but in our app we're going to import grid. And in fact, I sort of like the squiggly imports better, because if we need to import anything else out of Metoya UI, we can just pop it in here instead of sort of having it on each individual line for everything. So now what we can do here is, first things first, I'm going to wrap my whole thing. And by the way, my last two videos were all about grid and using the grid layout. So if you're unfamiliar with how grid or flexbox works, I highly recommend checking those videos out. I'm going to wrap everything in a grid container. And I'm going to move this guy into it. And you'll see there hasn't really been much of a change here, other than the fact that all of a sudden now, what is happening is our card is not taking up the whole width. And the reason for that is when our card is in a flexbox container, such as a grid container, it will only take up the space that it is needed unless told otherwise. So if we wanted this grid, for example, to take up, and if you can't remember, Metoya grid is spaced into a column layout into 12 separate components. So the screen is essentially split up into 12 separate components, 12 separate, etc., etc., etc. If we set the grid to take up 2, if we were to say the grid spacing should be xs equals 2, it will take up 2 of these columns, 2 out of the 12, which is essentially 1/6 of the screen. So let's give you an example of that. I'm going to wrap this in a grid item, and I'm going to say xs equals 2. Now, you'll notice even though we set the xs equal to 2, and it should only be taking up at most 1/6 of the page, it doesn't really do anything. It didn't really change. And the reason for that is if we go to our card.jsx, you'll see that we are actually setting a min width here. If I were to comment out this min width and not have it, well, then you'll see that it sort of warps to fit that 2 out of 12 width right there. And if we were to set it to 4, it starts becoming a bit more reasonable. And then if we set it to 6, you'll see it'll take up whatever, since 6 is half of 12, it'll always take up exactly half of the available space. So let's go ahead and give this something reasonable, like a min width of, let's say, 225. Let's see if that looks decent. And actually, I think we can even make it maybe 185. Okay, let's stick to around 200 then. So this is like, I guess, a reasonable min width to have. And it depends on our screen, but what we can do here is let's go ahead and make a couple of different cards. And let's go ahead and set their XS. So you can see here right now, all of them are taking up the available space split into half. But as soon as we make the screen small enough so that it is lower than 400 pixels, which is essentially what 2 cards side by side would be able to take up, you'll start to see that there's a bit of overlap. So the way we want to fix this with a grid layout is we want to say, okay, once the screen gets to a size where you're not going to be able to fit more than, for example, 1 card on the screen, what we could do is we can make, at extra small screens, we can make it so that each card will take up the entire full width of the available row. And you'll see here, now that we have xs equals to that, we can see the smaller we make our screen, it's not going to really cause any overlap or anything like that. But when we make our screen bigger, it's still going to have them on separate things. So what we can do is we can say on small, we can set it to 6 so that there are 2 cards on each row on smaller screens. So let's go ahead and set that. And you'll see here, since I'm still on XS, it's only taking up 1. But as soon as we start to make our screen a bit bigger, a bit bigger, a bit bigger, there we go. We're able to fit 2. And let's say on medium-sized screens and up, we can actually even fit 3 cards onto a single row. And the reason I'm making it 4 is because 12 divided by 4 is 3, which means 3 will be able to fit on the screen. So I'll start opening it up, opening up, and let me zoom out a bit. I'm zoomed in, so pixels aren't exactly good, and then bam, there we go. We'll see that we have 3 on the screen. Now what we can do, for example, is we can add a bit of, if we go to the grids API, you'll see here there are a couple of cool things we can add. For example, I can add spacing to this grid, and what that'll do is it'll make sure there's always a set amount of spacing in between it. So I can spacing equals 4, and what this value 4 means is that Metoya UI, if you were to look at Metoya UI's theme, they have a set amount of quote spacing pixels. I believe the default is set to 4. So if the default amount of pixels is set to 4, which means if I set spacing to 4, it's going to be 4 times whatever the default amount of pixels is. So 4 times 4, which means there's going to be around 16 pixels spacing between all of these cards. Now, if I simply wanted to add some gutter to the left and right of our grid, what I could do here is I can import make styles from core styles. Just copy it from here to save some time, and copy all of this. And if you're unfamiliar with make styles, I have a video on that as well, but essentially it's just a way to apply CSS stylings to your Material UI components, and any component really. So I say const classes equals use styles now, and over here I can be like, you know, grid container, and I can have, let's say for example, like padding left to like 20 px and padding right to also 20 px. And then I can come over here and say class name equals classes dot grid container. And let's see what that'll do. So you'll see here now I have a bit of a gutter on the left and right of my cards, and I can increase this even more. Although the more you increase it, it might condense the cards a bit closer together, which could cause things to sort of be a bit weird, but that is pretty much how that works. And then if I wanted, for example, let's say if I had another card on the row like this and I wanted it to be centered, well, what I could do is I can give justify equals to center. And what that'll do is it'll make sure that the card, when it is individually in a row, it is always centered. And for example, when we have a card like that, it will be in the center. But it sort of gets weird when you have an odd amount depending on how you want to space it out. For example, if I were to add a fifth card here, you'll see here that both of these sort of get centered just like that, which sometimes could be what you want and sometimes might be what you don't want. But that is pretty much it for this video. I hope that you guys got a lot of value, and if you did, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, or leaving a comment on what you'd like to learn next. This code sandbox.io link will be in the description of this video, and as well as the link to join the Discord community. And yeah, I hope everyone's staying safe, and thanks again for watching.